let me give an overview first, because we have talked about how potentially tens of millions of Americans could die from an EMP attack. And how is that so? Well, the reason for that is located in the vulnerability of the food and water infrastructures. EMP, in short, is a high-tech means of killing people the old-fashioned way, through starvation, disease, and societal breakdown. The water infrastructure is basically a gigantic electrical machine. It's dependent on electric pumps, valves, screens, filters. When you turn on your faucet and get a glass of clear water, that's a technological miracle. And there's an enormous electrical machine that makes that happen. 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, the electric pump was invented, and it made possible the building of a new civilization based on the idea that water can be made to flow uphill. You know, past civilizations had to build their water infrastructures using aqueducts and around wells, around areas where gravity would basically do the work. Well, most of the work is now done by electricity. So if you shut down the electric power, you're not going to have water. Well, what about the ponds and lakes or swimming pools in a city? Maybe you can drink the swimming pool water. But I wouldn't recommend in the high urban areas trying to drink open water sources, which tend to be heavily polluted, you know, with industrial wastes like arsenic and cyanide and cadmium. And it will be far worse in the aftermath. They won't stay at their same polluted level in the aftermath of an EMP attack, because part of our water infrastructure is the sewage treatment plants. And we have seen over and over again in blackouts that shut down the electric grid that sewage treatment plants fail, not just fail to operate, but the sewage spills back into the waterways. You know, that happened in Baltimore, you know, back in the 1990s, and it caused a huge health crisis in a small-scale blackout. And so you end up adding to it vast quantities of industrial wastes that go into that natural water that might be available, in addition to hospital wastes and all the pathogens that are associated with that. What about the food infrastructure? The food infrastructure is also basically a technological miracle that's based on electricity. And to illustrate this, let me just give you a couple of statistics. You know, in 1900, the population of the United States was 70 million people. This is just on the edge, the cusp, the beginning. We weren't it's the pre-electronic age. There was electricity, but we didn't have a national power grid yet. But we had 70 million people. 40% of the population were farmers. So that gives you an idea about, without electricity, how many people can this country support, assuming you have a well-developed 19th century economy, as Fritz Ehrmarth was referring to it, you know, where most of the people knew how to farm, and 40% actually were farmers. It's not a widely known statistic, but the reality today is our population, only 2% of the population, less than 2% of our modern population are farmers. 98% of our population is fed by less than 2% of our population. And we have almost 300 million people in this country now. So all those people, subtract 70 million from 300 million, and that gives you an idea of the population that's being supported by the electronic technology. 70 million taken away from 300 million. That's what's at risk. And the scale of productivity is even, there's another statistic that's interesting. Between 1900 and today, the amount of arable land has increased by only 6%. In other words, we're feeding all those people, you know, basically with the same agricultural area. What's made the difference? Tractors, the ability to pump water for irrigation, miracle crops that are built in an industrial scale, the ability to can food, automated butchering, the ability to have refrigerated warehouses. Let me talk about that a little bit. You know, in your grocery stores, you usually have about enough food under normal consumption to feed people for about 3 days. You're used to winter storms up here, and so people probably don't panic and strip the grocery store shelves, but down in DC, when they predict snow, the food very quickly disappears from the grocery store shelves. you know, because people end up hoarding. There are regional food warehouses. These grocery stores, the supermarkets, have to be resupplied every day, constantly, from these regional food warehouses. And that's basically the national larder for food, 30 to 60-day food supply there. You know, if you lose that, the nation starves. And that is sustained. You know, they have electrical generators there, you know, to provide it, but they're not calculated for a protracted EMP blackout. They're calculated for a storm or something like that. And if a hurricane comes along, we've had many cases in hurricanes and natural disasters, you know, where they've lost the electricity, and because food is so cheap and because it can be resupplied from the areas that are not affected, they just let it spoil. And so we have had spoilage at these big regional food warehouses. But if if it were to happen in a multi-state area or across the whole country, you know, would be in big trouble. Let me talk about, in the 3 minutes I'm going to try to allow myself here, let me talk about solutions. What can you do about the water infrastructure, about protecting that natural machine? Well, the first and most important thing is protect and recover the electric power grid. You know, protect and recover the electric power grid. If you protect and can recover the electric power grid, nothing is more important to restoring the water infrastructure, because really it's all about electricity. You know, one of these water treatment plants and the water pumping, water plants that supplies water to a big city can consume 100 megawatts of electricity. They don't have an emergency electrical generating supply because they consume too much energy. So they need the grid in order to operate. You can harden and have plans to recover key SCADAs, pumps, valves, and other systems minimally necessary to restore water service to the maximum possible population. Spare electronic parts for the vital equipment ought to be close at hand. Water utility crews ought to be trained for mass repair of systems vital to the infrastructure and black start of the infrastructure from a condition of protracted electric outage. State National Guards and city emergency services should include mobile water purification units and plans for providing water to large populations on an emergency basis. The Bioterrorism Act of 2002 that requires the EPA to conduct vulnerability assessments of the water infrastructure focused on terrorist threats from chemical or biological contamination. This could be amended to address the greater biochemical threat from an EMP attack that could cause water treatment and sewage facilities to malfunction, conceivably contaminating water supplies over a vast region. And here, the last recommendation here, which is, I think, the second most important recommendation, you know, is personal responsibility. Individuals and families should take personal responsibility to be prepared for an emergency by having stored water and means for water purification, like chlorine tablets on hand. And this would be useful not just in an EMP attack, but under a wide variety of emergency scenarios.